for joining us. My name is Jennifer Hill, and I'm a biologist at the National Conservation Training Center for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm calling in from my home office. Prior to introducing our guest speakers, I would like to highlight that in keeping with the mission of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to protect habitats and connect people with nature, the National Conservation Training Center acknowledges that it sits on the ancestral homelands of many Native nations. Several indigenous peoples stewarded these lands near Shepherdstown, West Virginia, or traversed this area during forceful removal. These include, but are not limited to, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. However, the Massachusetts Nation was the most prominent of the people in this area. As we have learned more about the indigenous peoples who had relationships with these lands before us, we better appreciate the soil on which we work, live, and learn. And for this, we give our deepest thanks to the ones that came before and to those of today, as it is on these lands that we are able to conduct the continuing education of service employees and our partners. We encourage others to learn more about the land on which they work and reside. At any time during the presentation, should you have questions, please enter them into the chat or email them to broadcast@fws.gov. We have a very full presentation, so if we don't get to your questions today, we will do our best to follow up with you afterwards. Today, we are going to hear about growing from land acknowledgements from 4 voices: Angelina Yost, Jennifer Heroux, Jennifer Owen-White, and Juliette Fernandez. First, we'll hear from Angelina Yost. Angelina is the National Coordinator for the Urban Wildlife Conservation Program. She works and lives on homelands of the Pamunkey, Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Rappahannock, Monacan, Nansemoy, Cheroanhaka, Nottoway, and Patawomack. Angelina has worked for more than 20 years in the field of interpretation and education, including years with the National Park Service and Desert National Wildlife Refuge Complex in Nevada. Next, we'll hear from Jennifer Heroux. Jennifer joined the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2008 and has more than 20 years of visitor services experience. Currently, she is the Visitor Services Manager at Desert National Wildlife Refuge Complex in Las Vegas, Nevada, and has been partnering with the Nuwuvi Working Group for almost 6 years. Our third speaker is Jennifer Owen-White. Jennifer is the first refuge manager of the Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Valle de Oro is located on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Southern Tiwa people and is the first urban refuge built from the ground up under the Urban Wildlife Conservation Program. Closing the broadcast, we'll hear from Juliette Fernandez. Juliette is the project leader for the Ridgefield National Wildlife Complex in Washington State. She served as the refuge supervisor for New Mexico and Arizona for 5 years. Oh, apologies. And she has served as an assistant manager, wildlife refuge specialist, and refuge biologist in her 17 years with the service. Juliette is driven by collaborative conservation, sound science, and building connected communities. Today, we welcome each of you. Angelina, I'm now going to hand it over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction. I will be talking with you about our partnership at the Desert National Wildlife Refuge Complex. If you could advance the slides, please. From 2008 to 2015, I worked at this complex as a visitor services manager. And the Desert Complex Refuges, along with Desert National Wildlife Refuge, is a homeland of Nuwuvi and Nulu. So this refuge complex is one of 3 examples we'll be sharing with you today that we'll be talking about not just that we had developed land acknowledgements, and some of us are still working on it, but really primarily we'll be sharing examples of how we move beyond them and are now co-creating stewardship and management projects together with tribal members. So I'm going to start by describing a process that was initially developed at the Desert Complex, and then this process then influenced the other two locations that will follow us. Next slide. So this project was called Knowledge to Action, is the beginning of a new approach to tribal consultation. It was started really by the Forest Service in 2008, and their partners were the 7 bands of Southern Paiute, or Nuuvi, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the focus really of this project was the traditional cultural connections of Nuuvi with the Spring Mountain, which was located on Forest Service land, and with the Sheep Mountains located on refuge land. And one of those tribal cultural connections is really just gathering information and research about their tribal cultural practices and connections, and sharing that across generations. Pictured here are 3 people holding pine nuts that were collected on the mountains. In the middle is a little girl smiling, holding some of her pine nuts. Next slide. So the Knowledge to Action project contained 4 primary deliverables. Just like when you're developing any kind of relationship, and we talk about this currently, I'm overseeing as national coordinator of the Urban Wildlife Conservation Program. We talk a lot about developing relationships and building connections with new partners, especially those that have been experiencing in the past and even today systematic exclusion and trauma, to enter that relationship with an open heart and not just state the needs and goals of the agency, because the ultimate goal is really building that partnership and that relationship. And so when we develop this Knowledge to Action project, the deliverables are really, number 1, the research Nuuvi wanted to the traditional cultural connections to the mountains. As a result of these meetings, then a consultation handbook of how to work better together was developed, which led to collaboration. This handbook for not only the Fish and Wildlife Service, but the Forest Service. And pictured here is the front cover of that handbook with the group of people that helped design the handbook. From there, these meetings led to creating a stewardship plan, a collaborative resource stewardship plan that talked not only about how to work together, but then how we steward the resources on the federal lands together with tribal members, whether it would be building a fence, or taking down a building, or changing a road, or developing interpretive exhibits that we'll be talking more about later today. But it could be any type of project research that's happening in the next year. That stewardship plan involved meeting with tribes to talk about working on resources together on an annual basis. Finally, the last deliverable is hosting an annual gathering for the mountains with Nuuvi. This involved bringing tribal members from 7 different states to these mountains and sharing through multi-generations some of their knowledge and best practices. And that would happen on an annual basis. Next slide. So through this project, it was a real transition from consultation to collaboration with Nuuvi. So we went from the typical standard check the box tribal consultation that was just required by law to real face-to-face collaboration. As a result, Nuuvi Working Group was established. And this is really important in government to government manner, rather than simply relying for governments to reach out to individuals they know. Establishing a process that where the Native American nation chooses who participates in the project. So you empower the Native American representatives to collect information from their own people, and that will help make sure there's trust and rapport throughout the entire nation on these working groups. The working group established, Nuuvi Working Group, consisted of designated representatives from every band, and there were 7 bands. And it provided that consistent engagement year after year. Engagement with Knowledge to Action project then definitely removed the barriers, established trust, and enabled all of us to think about tribal consultation in a different way. And pictured here is a group of people meeting through that collaborative process. Most importantly, this was to establish transparency and meaningful discussions. There was involved an informed consent meeting, which helps explain to participants the intended use of any information that is shared or gathered in these meetings. Everyone has a right to withhold or retract information and make sure anything that is shared has full review of any materials by the federal agencies and by the participating nations. Next slide. Now, once we had that very well-established collaborative process in place, then we were able to the foundation was then laid for collaborating on interpretive projects. So I'm going to share with you a few examples. It's really fascinating because you can see visually how the partnership with Nuuvi grew over the years. We were in the process of designing 3 different visitor centers on the complex. The first one was at Desert National Wildlife Refuge, which is pictured on the top, the visitor center there. We were too far along on the design of the building and the exhibits at this visitor center once we started that collaborative process and created the handbooks. So we couldn't conduct a full ethnographic research, but we were able to take a step back and incorporate a welcome message into the exhibits. So when you first enter the building, when you first walk in, the very first exhibit you see is an exhibit with a welcome message. Now, I'm acknowledging that 10 years or more ago, we did not talk about land acknowledgements. I did not know that phrase, and neither did our facilitators that worked with us and the tribes together. And so at the time, we used the phrase welcome message, which was written by the tribes and welcomed visitors, the public, to their home. So very similar to what I would consider a land acknowledgement now. So once that was established, we also incorporated information and messaging from Nuuvi on several exhibits, not just on the exhibit that talks about the past or about history, but it exhibits on the exhibits throughout the visitor center and talking about Nuuvi in the present. Fortunately, we had a lot more time to incorporate those practices from collaboration into the design and construction of the visitor centers at Ash Meadows and Pahranagat refuges. So we were able to then complete ethnographic research from Nuuvi and Nuwu that would then inform the interpretive content and the processes and in the management of the natural and cultural resources. And so you can see that well on display even at this welcome sign, which is in the bottom picture. It has Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, and underneath that, it says Nuuvi Ancestral Lands. Next slide. So because we were able to conduct full ethnographic research, and just to back up, that research was designed, driven, and conducted by tribal members. So the content that was collected by them, they chose what information to share with the federal agencies and to include in the exhibit. But it dramatically informed the interpretive messaging in both, especially in Ash Meadows and Pahranagat refuges. On the left is a picture of the Ash Meadows refuge where the content is woven in nearly every single exhibit throughout the center. It added depth and additional perspective to the interpretation, providing multiple ways to meaningfully connect with the resource. What you see here is the entrance, the exhibits as you enter into the building, and just like at Desert, the first exhibit that you see is the one that has the welcome message from Nuuvi and Nuwu. On the right is the exhibit at Pahranagat National Wildlife Refuge. When you get out of the car at the parking lot and you get out of your car and you walk up the sidewalk towards the building, this is the very first exhibit that you see. It names the refuge, and underneath it in the language of Nuuvi is the name of their name of the refuge in their language. So I know you can't see that, you'd have to really zoom in, but just to describe that for you. And underneath then that welcome message is the welcome statement written by the tribal members. So by the time we were developing the interpretive exhibits at Pahranagat, we had richer content to share than in the previous two visitor centers. And that was demonstrated, that really demonstrates the relationship and trust that grew over the years. The next slide. So at Pahranagat, we were able to even try to visually represent through physical exhibits their perspective or view of the world. So the contractors, in this particular exhibit, it's named 10 Directions. Nuwuvi rely on multiple elements and resources to describe the cultural landscape. Nuwuvi listen and look for messages, stories, and songs shared by the wind, animals, and plants. Everything is interconnected. Next slide. But it was very difficult to create a physical exhibit that represents an idea or a concept. And the contractors would design an artistic piece, but then it would not be approved by the tribal members. So after several attempts, it was clear that we needed to just allow space for Nuwuvi members to design it themselves. And this was a really exciting step to show how we moved from what was initially consultation to collaboration to empowerment, thus handing the reins and empowering tribal members to design their own piece and then taking that to the contractors and asking them to build it. This picture is the piece that shows, helps people understand their perspective of the 10 Directions. And it's 4 sandstone benches around a circle exhibit in the center in the desert. That's at Pahranagat Refuge. Next slide. So this process has a really steep learning curve for everyone. There is, but the final process requires a lot of investment and is very rewarding. But it requires time on the staff of the refuge and the facilitators to invest for meeting together and hosting and planning the gatherings as well as these meetings. So very critical to the success of the time it takes. And there's process, patience and willingness to approach collaboration with an open mind and an open heart. And then there's financial commitment. Most bands of Nuwuvi do not have a lot of financial resources. And so the federal agencies assisted with travel expenses, cost with the gathering, and cost for any assistance with volunteers helping with the gathering and the meetings. There's a picture here. We have the planning groups and also a picture of people sharing some of their cultural knowledge with others at the gathering. So at the end, though, this investment, next slide, is rewarding because the reward is the friendships and relationships that were established and are ongoing. I call the people in the slide my friends today. They are the Nuwuvi working group that helped with in celebrating the Ash Meadows exhibit at Ash Meadows Visitor Center. But these relationships are ongoing today. And so I'm going to now pass the baton to Jennifer, who is still working at Desert Complex, to talk about some current projects and things that are happening into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelina. I'm Jennifer Heroux, Visitor Services Manager for the Desert National Wildlife Refuge. I'm calling today from my home office to share about the next step in our Nuwuvi working group relationship. One where we took on co-management and decision-making in the opening of Black Canyon Archaeological Area at Pahranagat National Wildlife Refuge. Next slide, please. Black Canyon is a very sensitive cultural and archaeological area that has been closed to the public. It's filled with archaeological resources, particularly petroglyphs and pictographs, which the Nuwu refer to as rock writing. To open it really took developing trust and collaboration skills and listening to stakeholders. And from that, we completed a public site use plan in 2015. Pictured on screen is the cover to the site use plan with a central photo of the stakeholder group, which included the Nuwuvi working group and Fish and Wildlife Service staff. Next slide, please. So we were very fortunate in 2016 to get the funding to begin the project. And when the project kickoff happened, we brought our voices together, both Fish and Wildlife Service and the Nuwuvi working group, to begin implementing the stakeholders' vision of Black Canyon. On screen is a photo from one of our first meetings, and in it, tribal members and Fish and Wildlife Service staff are standing on the edge of the canyon looking down into the project site. And this stage really marks a growth, I felt, in the Nuwuvi relationship with the Fish and Wildlife Service in collaborative management decisions. that the Nuwu were willing to share their stories and cultural resources to non-tribal people, which they'd done before, but then to be able to open up this area at all is a statement of the long relationship building that came before. And for that, I thank Angelina. Next slide. Together, during this process, we planned all parts of the project and made them a reality, from trail alignment, visitor facilities, interpretive messages and exhibits, and additionally, spaces just for the Nuwu. The draft map on screen shows the proposed trail system and the locations of visitor facilities that were proposed for the canyon bottom. The trail circumnavigates a wetlands restoration area, and it follows along the canyon walls, which are rich with rock writing. Next slide. But as we designed the interpretation, it became clear that there were some messages and stories that really needed to come from the Nuwu voice alone. The site really spoke to their spirituality and their religion, and some tool for them to speak to that would allow them to speak more freely in the exhibits. So the Nuwubi working group worked with the designers to create a unique symbol to mark the panels that were in the Nuwu voice, the ones where they were speaking directly to the readers. On screen, we see the final graphic symbol, a blue circle with the words Nuwubi, Nuwu Homelands. A red-tailed hawk feather with 7 bands represents the 7 bands of the Nuwubi, and it floats in front of a small stream. And the main butte, if you notice, in the back is the main butte of Black Canyon, and it has eyes to represent the beings that live as rock writings there. Next slide. Now, the Nuwu really wanted to tell the story to visitors of the rock writing, its significance. They wanted it to be viewed with respect, its cultural significance understood. It's hard to overestimate how important this was to the Nuwu. But depicting rock writing is very sensitive, and we struggled on the best approach on how to do it. Though it was far from unanimous, we finally decided on an illustration style for this particular project rather than photographs. As one member of the Nuwubi working group described, this site is a library with volumes on the shelf to read. But like any kind of writing, misspelling is an issue. The graphic design firm had to go back to the group to learn how to create the writing correctly. So on screen, we have a draft illustration from the panels and a photo of the actual rock writing. Both are rectangles filled in with irregular lines, but in the photograph, there are 3 circles placed on top of the rectangle where the designers marked markings outside of it. Their question to the Nuwubi working group, were these markings part of the writing or not? Were they part of the petroglyph or not? The Nuwu, because of this long process of trust, were willing to help us correct these misspellings. Next slide. Fortunately, the project is now in the middle of installation of its exhibits and visitor facilities. So on screen, we see 3 elements of the project site underway. We have on top, on the left is a mile marker with a roadrunner cutout that marks the trail. On top right, an interpretive panel looking towards a butte with rock writing. On the bottom right, the solitude circle, a semicircle of concrete benches nestled in the trees. This is a space for reflection for the public, but it's also a spiritual spot for the Nuwubi and was designed with them in mind. From our long relationship, this allowed us to navigate through some very tough discussions on this project and allowed us to reach collaborative consensus for the site. For the Nuwu, it gave them trust and confidence in the Fish and Wildlife Service to open a culturally sensitive area to the public. And for the Fish and Wildlife Service, this long relationship gave us the confidence to make room for the Nuwu in the co-management of a piece of the refuge. So with that, next slide, please. I'd like to continue this story by passing it on to Jennifer Owen-White at Valle de Oro.
Thank you, Jennifer. I want to start today by just thanking Angelina and Jennifer and all the staff at the Desert Complex for the work that they did leading the way in these tribal relationships. We learned a ton from them when we started working on Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge, and one day hope to have such strong and trusting relationships like they have. My name is Jennifer Owen-White. I am honored to be the refuge manager for the Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge. Our refuge is relatively young. We are just 9 years old, and I've been working at the refuge for 8 of those years now. Next slide. So I do want to start by humbly acknowledging that the Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge sits upon 570 acres of the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Tiwa people. The Tiwa people have stewarded these lands for generations, and in the case of Valle de Oro, our neighbors at the Pueblo of Isleta continue to play a significant role in the refuge's protection, restoration, and success. And that's what I'm going to tell you about today. Next slide. So I was a new staff member. This was a brand new refuge. And so my main job as the refuge manager was to build relationships. And so I'm going to start by telling you about some of the relationships and the way that we built relationships at Valle de Oro. Most of this work was done with the Pueblo of Isleta, who are our neighbors just 1 mile south from the border of the refuge. But New Mexico has 19 pueblos and 4 tribal nations, and we worked with many of those pueblos and tribal nations in the overall design and coordination of the refuge. So in terms of the Pueblo of Isleta, we started our relationship with tours for the tribal elders. We were invited, I was invited to speak multiple times before the tribal council about the refuge. Every time the Pueblo got a new governor, which is every 2 years, I would send them a letter and stop by and welcome them and introduce ourselves. And then we really started developing relationships with the Pueblo's staff in the environment department, the water resources department, the cultural resources department, and the behavioral health. The interesting thing about Albuquerque is not only do we have many pueblos around us, but we have a really large urban indigenous community. So a lot of our work has been working with the tribes directly, but we've also been working with organizations like the Native American Community Academy to develop relationships with urban, tribal, and indigenous people. The pictures you'll see on this slide, a couple things. Down at the bottom, you'll see 2 different drum groups. We often have drum groups who open events on the refuge. The one at the bottom left are from the Pueblo of Isleta. The one in the bottom right are the students from the Native American Community Academy. In the middle there, you'll see some of our interns from the Native American Community Academy helping us on tours with the tribal elders, and one of our interns, Haley, who became Miss Naka. And then the last picture on there is of myself at a presentation with, at the time, Governor of the Pueblo of Isleta, Eddie Paul Torres. Next slide. So not only did we want to build relationships, but we also wanted to do work ourselves and learn the history of the land. So we had one of our interns was really passionate about this work, and she helped us put together a training for our Valle de Oro staff on the history of tribes in New Mexico, and specifically focused on the relationship between tribes, indigenous people, and the federal government. So what you see here is a timeline that was very specific to New Mexico and specific to Valle de Oro, that started time immemorial with our ancestral lands, moving through Spain, coming into New Mexico, the Pueblo Revolt, which was a very significant event in New Mexico, moving through a lot of the decisions that were made by the federal government that then impact relationships, and then on to the establishment of the refuge. Next slide. So the biggest thing we heard from our partners and our tribal neighbors was the most important thing they wanted out of the refuge was youth employment and education programs. And so that's where you'll see a lot of our work has gone so far, is focusing on employment and education. Starting off with our relationship with the Native American Community Academy, we've had multiple years of internships with them and students who would come out, do research on the refuge and present that research at the end of the year. We had a partnership with a group called Earth Force who worked with the Sandia Pueblo and taught young people about water resources and water quality testing. We partner with the Ancestral Lands Program, which is a part of the Southwest Conservation Corps, and we have hired interns to help with tribal engagement. But I will say that we learned a lot from that. We had 2 years of interns who were tribal engagement interns, and we realized that that wasn't the best way to build relationships. It shouldn't fall on one person in the refuge to be in charge of that. It certainly shouldn't fall on someone who is an intern, and it honestly felt a little bit like tokenizing. So we realized that that was a misstep, and we stepped back from that, and now we hire interns through the Ancestral Lands Program as part of our biology program, as part of our visitor service program, and integrated into the work of the refuge. And everyone at the refuge is responsible for tribal relationship building with their counterparts in the tribes. We also partner with the fisheries program on the Native Fish in the Classroom program. And for the past couple years, the Pueblo of Isleta has come out and used Valle de Oro as the location where their students would release the native fish that they had grown in their classrooms. Next slide. Well, as we're going to the next slide, there we are. Oops, we went a little too fast, back one. Another big partnership with Ancestral Lands is, of course, our Youth Corps program. The refuge was established in 2012. Our very first Youth Corps happened in 2014. You'll see them in the big picture there. That's our Native American Youth Corps. And it was a new concept as part of Ancestral Lands that we are really happy got started on Valle de Oro. It was a partnership between the Refuge, National Park Service, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And in that picture there, we actually have our Southwest Region Director for BIA and the National Director for BIA who came out to visit, who were so excited about this program. Our Ancestral Lands crews do a ton of different things on the refuge, from helping with restoration projects to art projects like you see in the top right corner, putting up some murals done by a local artist named Nani Chacon. And then they also, on the top left corner, you'll see a screenshot of an oral history project they conducted for us in talking to community members to learn about the history of this land. Next slide. So we talk about employment, it's also education, and it's also storytelling and connecting to the land. And so we really focus on science and art and that storytelling of connection to the land. Some examples you'll see here up in the top left corner is Julia. Julia was an intern who worked with us through the Bureau of Indian Affairs and then stayed on with the refuge after that for a little while, who did water resources research with us. Below that picture, we've got our Native American Youth Corps who are presenting about water quality data and research that they were doing. Top middle, you'll see some of the youth who were doing bird banding with us on the refuge. And then these beautiful butterflies that you see are a brand new project that's at the entrance to our new visitor center. It's a project with an apprentice group called ALMA, Apprenticeships for Leaders in Mosaic Arts. And they actually were able to interview and get stories from tribal members and tribal elders and incorporate that into the designs and the storytelling on this mosaic art. Next slide. Okay. We also are a brand new refuge who's a former dairy farm, so we have a lot of restoration work to do, and it's been a great opportunity to work with groups like Audubon Southwest and the Pueblo of Isleta Behavioral Health to get young people out to learn about the land, but also help restore the land and do planting events at the refuge. Next slide. So we are a refuge who does have land acknowledgements, and we try to incorporate land acknowledgements into many of the different things we do. As a newer refuge, this was something that was important for us in acknowledging the history of this land. And we do understand, and as hopefully you'll see throughout this presentation, that land acknowledgements maybe are just the beginning or even an intermediary step, but there's so much work that needs to be done before land acknowledgements and of course after land acknowledgements to really build in trust in these relationships. What you see on this slide are multiple places where we have different land acknowledgements. One is in our brand new visitor center that's going to be opening up, where we work collaboratively with the Pueblo of Isleta on the welcome acknowledgement there. We have a simple acknowledgement as part of our Junior Ranger activity book, as part of our Backyard Refuge program that we do with our Friends group. We were participating also in a major art exhibit in Albuquerque called Species in Peril, and we were lucky enough that one of our team members wrote the land acknowledgement for the whole exhibit. It was featured in the exhibit guide at the very entrance to the exhibit. And then we also partner with groups like the Wilderness Society on transportation and equitable access, and we're able to help with the land acknowledgement in that report. Next slide. We also were very honored to host our very first Indigenous Peoples Day back in 2019. It was a partnership with Southwest Conservation Corps and the Ancestral Lands Program, our Friends group, the University of New Mexico, and a local arts organization. We had a panel of speakers, we had young dancers, we had really important and powerful discussions and dinner together out on the refuge. Next slide. So one of the things we're most excited about in strengthening our relationship is the design and construction of our visitor center. We took a lot of time to do the outreach for the contract for our visitor center, and we're very lucky to be able to contract with a small Native American owned business from the Pueblo of Isleta, CF Padilla. They work in joint venture with a larger organization in Albuquerque. So we get to support a small business who's really dipping their toe into this type of work, but who also bring a lot to the project, a lot of ideas and involvement from the tribe into the work at the visitor center. You can see a picture of what the visitor center will look like. And if you see that roof line, if you look at it from one direction, it actually fits the line of the mountains, the Manzano Mountains, which are part of the Pueblo of Isleta lands. And so the whole roof line of the visitor center fits some significant features in the area. And that's imitated on our interpretive signs. Next slide. So inside the visitor center, we worked really closely with the environment department from the Pueblo of Isleta, as well as cultural resources. And we co-created multiple exhibits together, including some little vocabulary boxes that serve as tables or seating. The Pueblo picked the animals and plants that would be featured and shared with us the words in Tiwa. So we included the Tiwa word, the English word, and the word in Spanish. We, of course, worked on the land acknowledgement and the welcome at the entrance. And we have an interactive area where people get to share their connection to the land. And in order to inspire people of what they can add, we started with a quote from a former Pueblo of Isleta governor, Verna Teller. She wrote this quote and shared it with us for our exhibit. Next slide. The most recent thing we've done, and what I'm really excited about, is we've developed a hiking club with the Pueblo of Isleta through the Ancestral Lands Program. One of those interns I told you we have that is part of our visitor service program, Brittany, she helped run this program, and it took young people from the Pueblo to culturally significant public lands across the middle Rio Grande in New Mexico. So they went up to the forest, They went to Bandelier National Monument. They came here to Valle de Oro. And because the activity was completely run by members, by tribal members, they could go places that maybe other people couldn't go. They could have discussions, but they were all kind of connected back to the work that we do at the refuge. And it's a really big step for us in making those relationships and strengthening those relationships. Next slide. So that's a ton of stuff from Valle de Oro, and there's so much more that I could share, but I'm really excited for us to continue these relationships and get to the place like where Desert Refuge is, and continue co-creating work with our tribal neighbors. The last thing I want to show you in my thank you slide here, there's a little picture, a little painting that some of the youth did of our very first Native American youth corps, and that is me, I guess, pointing or teaching, rangers pointing at things, getting people excited about the refuge. So I'm going to pass it on to my former supervisor and a really great colleague and friend, Juliette Fernandez, who's going to tell you about the work that she's doing up in the Pacific Northwest.
Thank you, Jennifer. So thank you, everybody, for having me. I appreciate it. I am Juliette Fernandez. I'm the new project leader at Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge Complex. I've been here a little bit over a year, and I'm just going to share with you a little bit about my journey in making connections with the tribal community here on this site. Next slide, please. So before applying for this position, I learned some things. I learned that there were 3 primary tribes that I would be working with: the Chinook Indian Nation, the Cowlitz Indian Tribe, and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. I also learned there was a significant archaeological site on refuge called Kathropodal, and there was a big research and excavation project there in 1994. And after that excavation, there was the creation of a living plank house on the refuge. It was built with the tribes, and it was a reflection of the plank houses that were found at the Kathropodal site. I also learned that there were a number of memorandums of understanding, or MOUs, underway that needed to be complete. And so those were some of the things that I knew were ahead of me in taking this position. I also learned that there was some significant issue resolution to be had with and among our tribal community, and that it wouldn't be easy. But I worked really hard to build bridges, and I was hopeful to get this all moving forward. And the picture you see here in the top of this triangle is a picture of the Kathropodal site. On the bottom left is a picture of the plank house that was constructed with the tribes, and then the bottom right is just a snapshot of an MOU. Next slide, please. So when I first got here, the way that I started was sending a letter to the tribal chairman and chairwoman of the 3 tribes to introduce myself and just share with them my commitment to being a good partner to them, and being available for anything that they might have. And after that, I set up meetings just to listen. Next slide. So I learned different things from each tribe that I spoke with. The Chinook Indian Nation chairman taught me that their people came from Kathropodal, that when we were doing the Kathropodal excavation, they the Fish and Wildlife Service put a call out to the area tribes to see who would like to partner with us. And at the time, the Chinook answered the call. They came and worked hand in hand with that excavation. As a continuation of that partnership, they built the plank house with the Fish and Wildlife Service and with Portland State University. So there was a lot of significant emotional investment from the Chinook Indian Nation and the artwork that went into the plank house, and it was designed by them and with Chinook Indian Nation sensibilities. And what I also learned was they were here and they're still here. Next slide, please. The Cowlitz Indian tribe, when I met with them, they taught me that their ancestors traded and harvested and intermarried at Kathropodal. They're very interested in protecting and restoring the plants and animals of the area. And in fact, they worked with the refuge on doing a big habitat restoration project in our Oaks area and in the reintroduction of Columbia white-tailed deer on the refuge. They also taught me that the plank house was very important to them as well, and that they were here and they're still here. Next slide, please. And the third group that I worked with was the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. And they taught me that their ancestors were throughout the Pacific Northwest and Southern Washington before being displaced. They're very interested in first foods on the refuge, such as Wapato, and they're very invested in Indigenous education as well. And again, I learned they were here and they're still here. Next slide, please. So I learned through talking with them that there were a number of things that were going well with the refuge, like education programs and harvesting opportunities that were really meaningful to them. But as I stated earlier, there were also significant bridges to be built with and among our tribal community. There were divided views on who was here and when, who has a claim to the ancestral land, who has rights to use the plank house and when. I learned of promises that were made or broken by the government, the agency, and the refuge. I learned that they had some negative experiences on site and some negative interactions with members of the refuge team. I learned that some of the interpretive material was not shared with them prior to being posted, and they had concerns with that. And I just learned that there was some broken trust and they were leery of the path ahead. Next slide, please. So I called Angelina because I knew that she had paved the way on some really great collaborative conversations. And I wanted to hear how she worked at Desert. And she introduced me also to Portland State University Professor Jeremy Spoon. And I picked his brain on how he hones his magic of creating these bridges. And what I decided I needed to do was start from the beginning. I sat down and I created a mind map just for myself. And I asked myself these questions, like, what authorities do we have? What are the missions and the visions of the different entities? What are the goals? Where are we now, and where do we want to be? What expectations do I share? What are their passions or relationships? And what issues have there been within the government, the agency, and the refuge in the past? And what's the best way to engage with them now? I apologized to them for experiences of the past, and I committed to making tomorrow a better day and starting again with transparency and an open heart. Next slide, please. So I got back together with them and I asked them things like, what have we worked on with you in the past? I wanted to understand, how can I be a better partner to you now? What can I read to learn more from your perspective? How often would you like to meet? How do you prefer to communicate? How would you like to work through the MOUs that we knew we had to finalize? And I asked them how they felt about a land acknowledgement. Next slide. And one of these tribal partners said to me, "Shall we get asked by every business in the area if they can just send over a quick land acknowledgement that they can post on their website, kind of a box check?" And they said, "We're so tired of being asked for land acknowledgements. We just want reciprocity. We want genuine relationships and partners who care that we were and are on this land." I had seen land acknowledgements work beautifully at Valle de Oro. And, I had worked very successfully with some of my tribal partners in the Southwest before coming out here, but this was a very different scenario. And it was very clear to me that it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. You need to ask. So I paused land acknowledgements and I paused the MOUs just to learn. Next slide, please. So I have monthly calls. I've met with the chairman, the biology departments, education departments, cultural departments, just to keep them updated on programs and projects and events, and ask them to share with me any areas of concern and get input or partnership opportunities. And I developed these goals for how I wanted to work with them. I wanted to be recognized among Indigenous communities as an environment where all Northwest Native peoples see us as a partner and ally. I wanted to develop, coordinate, and formalize interpretive material in conjunction with our partners, speaking with them, not for them. I wanted to seamlessly braid cultural resource education in with natural resource education to further energize and inspire respect and stewardship. I wanted to improve our tribal relationships by ensuring timely, frequent, responsive, and inclusive coordination, both formally, like I need to do from a government to government perspective, but also informally. And I wanted to strengthen an all-inclusive atmosphere with the staff, docents, volunteers, reframed on empathy and grounded in our mission. Next slide, please. So in looking at these three tribes and that there are divided views, I tried to find that middle ground. Next slide. And I found that middle ground in the natural resources. I spoke, I was new to the refuge, and I spoke with our visitor services team and I asked, what are the themes that we teach about here? And they shared with me oaks, watersheds, and wetlands. So I did some research with all of these tribes and found that oaks, watersheds, and wetlands and everything that we do on refuge is very much embedded in everything that they value. And this might be an opportunity to share what we do to preserve these things in conjunction with them. Next slide, please. So we went on a new journey on how we work on sharing the Indigenous perspectives with our visiting public. So we will honor the Plank House for its historical and thriving significance, but it's not just that. Honoring the land should be everywhere, living and breathing into everything that we do. So now in our interpretive, our curriculum, programs, we are infusing Indigenous sensibilities into each. So for example, in this watershed circle, I have 4 circles: oaks, watersheds, wetlands, and Plank House. In the watersheds example, we know that lamprey is significant to all 3 of these tribes. Wapato was a first food to all of these tribes. And the river of life is an opportunity for us to speak about the river going back a millennia and still important today for all of the tribes, and hopefully inspire heightened respect with our visitors. Next slide, please. So here's where we are now. We're reframing our messaging with our tribal partners in our interpretation, our curriculum, and our docents. Next slide. We are in a planning stage of building a community nature center, a visitor center, if you will. Valle de Oro and Desert have certainly paved the way. And this is our opportunity again to speak through them and not for them. So we're also doing focus groups with them to see what messaging and facilities and art and experience they want to share. In fact, we have some next week. Focus groups. Next slide, please. Working with Portland State University, of course, Jeremy Spoon, who I mentioned previously, framed the spirit with which I engage with our partners, but we're also working with the Indigenous Studies program out of Portland State University to see what opportunities we can have to bring students out and really work with them with that reciprocity. Next slide, please. And we're doing the Ancestral Lands Cruise, so we learned from Valle de Oro and saw those relationships thrive and how meaningful it was to the partners in the community. So this year we brought the Ancestral Lands Cruise to Northwest Youth Corps, which hadn't been here previously, and we're going to pilot it for this area. Next slide, please. And harvesting has always taken place here, and it's something very important to them. So that's something that's ongoing of First Foods, something that's ongoing, but we're also considering new locations on some of our other sites. Next slide. In addition, we do have our friends group did invite the cultural education coordinator from one of the tribes to be a judge on their youth art contest. So even non-tribal specific opportunities there, we're reaching out to them. And actually this picture that you see here was submitted, we've got 300 duck pictures. And then we got several that were tied back to the Indigenous connection. And this is a picture drawn by a youth participant reflecting the art that's on the plank house. We also have a member of the Cowlitz tribe and the Chinook Nation as board members on our friends group that was there before me. It's a great way to engage with them as a member of our community and have those opportunities for further engagement. Next slide, please. So the memorandums of understanding are underway. I started from the beginning so that I could hear what they really wanted out of the partnership. My goal is no surprises. I want full transparency. It's been a long process already, and I anticipate that it'll continue to be, but I think it's very important to build those bridges, center it in respect, and I always let them know that I'm on their time frame and we'll work through it together. Next slide, please. Recently, the spiritual leader of the Cowlitz tribe thanked me for the relationship and committing to the tribes, and she felt like that relationship had never been highlighted with such intentionality, and that meant a lot to me. And she asked if when we have a very large restoration project happening on one of our other refuges that's connecting the Columbia River back to its historical floodplain. And she asked if they could do a drum ceremony at the ribbon cutting. And I said, absolutely, we would be honored to have you. Additionally, before we did fish salvages, I asked if any of our tribal partners would like to do a blessing. And so in this picture that you see, that's the vice chairman of the Chinook Indian Nation, and he came out and did a blessing. And one of the things that was especially meaningful to me is it mattered a lot to the people that were doing the salvage that day. But also I had been on Teams calls with all of these tribes for a very long time, for about a year. And when the vice chair got out of his truck to do this blessing, we just jumped at each other and gave a big hug as if we had known each other for a very long time. And I know that there's still a lot of trust to be built, but I felt like that was a very positive step. Next slide, please. And lastly, I had mentioned the Quetzalcoatl excavation of 1994. Something that was really neat that happened is these three tribes formed a consortium to repatriate some ancestral remains that were part of this excavation. So with the assistance of our Cultural Affairs Department, I worked with Ainan Raymond, we started that process. I sent them formal letters at each of the major milestones, but I also spoke with them monthly, or if I took any step in any direction, to let them know where I was in that process. So not just when I had to, but when I felt it was very important to continue to speak with them about this. You have to put out a notice of disposition, and that time period just closed, which means that we can move forward with the repatriation. Returning those ancestral remains was very important to them, and it was very important to me. I wanted them to know that I was here with them, and beyond just acknowledging the land, together we were going to bring their ancestors home. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I will hand it back to Jennifer Hill.
Great. Thank you. Thank each of you. Typically at this time, we would go into questions and answers, but we are at the top of the hour. So I would encourage you, if you have a question, to please go ahead and put it in the chat. We'll provide the questions to our presenters, and then they will get back to you via email. I do want to thank Angelina, Jennifer, and Juliette for their time today, for sharing your experiences and your knowledge. We really appreciate that. And the folks watching appreciate it as well, I know. So, and I do want to provide a reminder that NCTC will continue to host the Tribal Broadcast Series on the third Thursday of each month. Our next broadcast is titled Tribal Treaties, which is Thursday, November 18th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll have our guest speaker, Kevin Gover from the Smithsonian, speaking about treaties next month. And each broadcast is recorded and available on NCTC's website. If you wish to learn more about future broadcasts or past broadcasts, or you have any questions or want to be added to our listserv, please just email me at Jennifer_Hill@fws.gov. And thank you all for joining us today.